Then the young Naval Reserve officer launched into an impassioned denunciation of the Vietnam War from a veteran's perspective. He described what he had seen in Vietnam as a civil war, a liberation movement aimed at shedding both the remnants of French colonialism and the current burden of American imperialism. "We found that most people didn't even know the difference between communism and democracy," he explained to the South Vietnamese. South Dakota Senator George McGovern reflected later that, after explaining how the South Vietnamese peasants were victims in the war, Kerry shifted gears, claiming that the American GIs were also victims, that taxpayers' money was going to support corrupt local dictators throughout Southeast Asia. What quickly became clear was that Kerry was prosecuting the U.S. government for war crimes, as ordained through such policies as free fire zones, harassment and interdiction fire, search and destroy missions, carpet bombings, and the torture and execution of prisoners. Kerry was placing the blame on the U.S. government for instituting such immoral policies. But Kerry was still not finished. Indeed, he was there, under the bright lights with all the cameras pointed at him, to advance the cause of veterans' rights. Recounting the heroism American troops had displayed at Hamburger Hill and Khe Sanh and Hill 8815 and Firebase 65, he choked on the very concept of Vietnamization. Now we are told that the men who fought there must watch quietly as American lives are lost, so that we can exercise the incredible arrogance of Vietnamizing the Vietnamese, Kerry declared, his voice quivering with emotion. Each day, he started, but he couldn't finish the thought as the gallery erupted into thunderous applause, most of it from his fellow veterans. Without hesitation, Kerry continued to take direct aim at Nixon, accusing the president of letting the war in Southeast Asia drag on just because he refused to go down in history as the first U.S. chief executive to lose a war. Then, in his most famous utterance, the decorated veteran posed a pair of tough questions to the senators. "How do you ask a man to be the last man to die in Vietnam?" Kerry inquired. "How do you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake?" An eerie silence fell over the chamber. Then muffled murmurs could be heard. It was a poignant question and had no quick and easy answer. The reporters covering the hearing knew they had their lead. Kerry's second question would be the next day's headline. They made sure of it. According to Kerry, employment opportunities for Vietnam veterans barely existed, particularly for those who came back physically or psychologically impaired. He offered the statistic that 1 out of every 10 unemployed Americans was a Vietnam veteran, with the percentage much higher among African Americans. "The hospitals across the country won't or can't meet their demands," Kerry informed the senators, of those too disabled even to seek work. "It is not a question of not trying. They haven't got the appropriations. A man recently died after he had a tracheotomy in California, not because of the operation, but because there weren't enough personnel to clean the mucus out of the tube, and he suffocated to death." He went on to deliver his stinging indictment of the entire U.S. foreign policy establishment. Specifically, he accused the Johnson years Robert McNamara, Walt Rostow, McGeorge Bundy, and Roswell Gilpatrick, by name, of having deserted their troops, adding that there is no more serious crime in the law of war. After spelling out such a bleak assessment of everything involving the United States and Vietnam policy, Kerry ended his testimony on a hopeful note. 30 years from now, when a man is walking down the street without an arm or a face or a leg, and a little boy asks him why, he will have to say Vietnam, Kerry speculated, and mean not a desert, not an obscene memory, but mean instead a place where America finally turned, and soldiers like us helped in the turning. Upon that, the veterans in back of the gallery sprang to their feet and gave their spokesman a standing ovation. The senators just looked at one another and smiled. They knew a political star had been born. Decades later, former U.S. Army Captain Max Cleland, who would go on to be elected a U.S. Senator, still vividly remembered April 22, 1971. "It was a day that changed my life," he explained. "Kerry's words still bolt right through what's left of my body. When he said, 'How do you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake?' that was gutsy. Kerry understood that, like me, our tour of duty, our generational duty, had just begun. Even when he was an 11-year-old boy, there was a feeling that John Forbes Kerry was touched with destiny, or more accurately, that public service was instilled in him by his parents. There was, however, a touch of the parvenu in all of this, a fierce family belief, not unlike that which Joseph Kennedy imposed on his 4 sons, that the Kerry boys, John and Cameron, could accomplish any feat, no matter how difficult. But to do so would take discipline. Although John Kerry spent the first year of his life in Groton, his childhood is one of constant relocating. Kerry is a man without geographic roots, is the way Boston Globe journalist Michael Kranish explained his upbringing. His youth stretched through a dozen schools across 2 continents. The one place that Kerry didn't feel like a transient, however, was Millis, Massachusetts. Late in 1944, his family purchased a home in that Charles River Valley town 15 miles southwest of Boston. It had a long driveway lined with rhododendrons. They lived there for almost 5 years. We had a great house on a farm in Millis, and my dad was then in a law firm commuting back and forth to Boston, Kerry recalled of his youth. His years in Millis, more than any other place, gave Kerry a sense of home. The idyllic Millis stint ended in 1949, when Richard Kerry moved his family to Washington, D.C. He had gotten a job with the Office of General Counsel for the Navy. From 1951 to 1954, Richard Kerry worked as an attorney for the Bureau of United Nations Affairs in the State Department. Eager to spend time in Europe, as was his wife, in late 1954 he accepted the post as legal advisor at the U.S. Mission to Berlin and U.S. Attorney for Berlin. He spent 1958 at the NATO Defense College in Paris. Although the Kerrys lived in St. Braque, Berlin, and Oslo, young John's real base for 2 years was Switzerland, at boarding schools. Kerry harbored mixed emotions about his time in Switzerland. His second year, he contracted scarlet fever and was sad that his parents didn't journey down from Berlin to help lift his spirits. They just weren't able to get there then, Kerry recalled. Yet for the rest of his life, whenever he grew depressed, he thought of the Swiss Alps for inspiration. Catholicism also played an important part in Kerry's growing up years in Switzerland. Often sitting alone in a back pew, staring at the altar or lighting a candle, Kerry found his religion brought solace. In 1957, when John Kerry was 13, his father sent him to the Fessenden School in West Newton, Massachusetts. The motto of the boys' boarding school was "Work conquers all." With jacket and tie mandatory, Fessenden was a place where lifelong friendships were formed. While at Fessenden, John Kerry met a tall, very athletic jokester named Richard Pershing. Dick Pershing was a cut-up extraordinaire. By the time he turned 14, he was already a prep school legend throughout New England. Born in 1943 in New York City, Pershing was the grandson of General John J. Blackjack Pershing. Besides playing soccer together, Pershing and Kerry developed a sort of comedy routine that always brought howls of laughter from their peers. They were like Butch in Sundance or Mutt and Jeff, their mutual friend George Butler later recalled. The year they spent together at Fessenden forged an unbreakable friendship between the two. Once Kerry moved on to St. Paul's School, his 7th school by 9th grade, and Pershing enrolled in Phillips Exeter Academy, they stayed in touch, exchanging letters and crossing paths at school and social events. One of Kerry's closest friends at St. Paul's was a tall, skinny, brown-eyed Italian-American classmate from far Rockaway, New York. They bonded in the final 2 years before graduation. Danny Barbiero was the son of Italian immigrants from Naples and Bari. His father was a Nassau County assemblyman who later became a district court judge. The bond forged between Kerry and Barbiero would last a lifetime. John was always talking about global issues, Barbiero said. He was only 18 years old and he knew just everything about politics, particularly civil rights. That annoyed some people, no doubt about it. An important moment of reckoning came to Kerry on November 7, 1960. He was a 16-year-old student fascinated by the junior senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. Kerry is remembered at St. Paul's for his zealous promotion of Kennedy, once he became the Democratic nominee for president, that is, running against Republican Richard M. Nixon. Not only did Kerry share initials with his political hero, JFK, but he spoke with a somewhat similar inflection. A debate was set up at St. Paul's, with Kerry cast as Kennedy and Lloyd McDonald representing Nixon. On the eve of the debate, Kerry took a train from Concord to Boston. Near North Station in Boston, people were congregating to hear Kennedy speak at Boston Garden, wearing hats and waving placards with great anticipation. Chants of JFK swirled all about. "What's going on?" Kerry asked. Somebody told him. "Oh, Senator Kennedy's coming in for the last speech before he goes to the Cape for Election Day." So an excited Kerry wandered into the rally, watching the political theater from a standing position near the exit. Missing his scheduled train back to Concord, Kerry eagerly waited Kennedy's arrival. Senator Kennedy arrived on stage smiling, waving to the throngs of cheering people. Kerry got caught up in the emotion. The natural bond he had felt with Kennedy had been heightened. "Suddenly I felt as if I were part of his campaign," Kerry recalled. "It was exhilarating." After the speech, he collected pro-Kennedy pamphlets and headed back to New Hampshire. "I got all these materials I was able to use and worked on the train the whole way back to Concord," Kerry recalled. "They helped me prepare for my why Kennedy should be president argument the next day." Unfortunately, the school was predominantly Republican, and McDonald, defending Nixon, won the votes. But I took comfort. My man Kennedy won the real contest. Kerry was intrigued by the energy and idealism of President Kennedy and his family. They made American public life exciting. When Edward Kennedy, the president's 30-year-old brother, ran for the Senate from Massachusetts in 1962, Kerry jumped on the bandwagon, handing out pamphlets and blaring endorsements from the loudspeaker attached to the roof of his VW Bug. John Kerry followed his father's footsteps to Yale University in 1962. The grand old New Haven campus fairly glittered with possibilities in an eager freshman's eyes. Danny Barbiero found himself stunned that first semester by the volume of historical detail his former prep school and now college roommate had absorbed about the place. John was just so excited to be at Yale, Barbiero recalled. He was absolutely enthralled, just beside himself with glee. The two ex-St. Pauli's roomed together in a suite on the freshman campus in Bingham Hall. About midway through the first semester, Kerry and Barbiero went to the New Haven Green to see President Kennedy address a rally next to campus. It was at that October event, around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, that Barbiero introduced Kerry to fellow classmate Harvey Bundy. "I was less excited about Kennedy than probably one might have expected given the family connections," the always honest Bundy remembered. "Kennedy gave a political hack speech. Kerry was all enthused about it. I wasn't. We agreed to disagree." Kerry relished holding court on every policy issue before the Kennedy administration, particularly James Meredith's seminal enrollment as an African American at the University of Mississippi and the building of the Berlin Wall. At the time, in 1962, Vietnam had not yet become a hot discussion topic. After all, when Kennedy had been elected in November 1960, only 900 U.S. military personnel were stationed in Vietnam. By 1963, however, there were some 16,000 American troops there. The Kennedy administration went on to condone the overthrow of South Vietnamese President Ngo Dien Diem, to dispatch the U.S. Army Green Berets to Southeast Asia, and to commit American-manned helicopters and tactical aircraft to help defeat North Vietnam's Ho Chi Minh. John Kerry, meanwhile, was getting an education about the war, from the U.S. policy perspective, from a pretty good source, his roommate's uncle. Bill Bundy used to come up to New Haven occasionally, Kerry recalled, and I remember one night sitting on the floor of our room late into the night, drinking beer with the then Assistant Secretary of State. I was all ears, a sponge. We listened to him talk about Vietnam in depth, why it was important, and what our generation would have to do. It was in October of his freshman year that John Kerry also met David Thorne, an energetic, high-strung, athletic six-footer with keen hazel eyes and neatly groomed light brown hair. The charming Thorne lived in Yale's Vanderbilt Hall and majored in American literature. Harvey Bundy introduced Kerry and Thorne one evening at my brother's place.